She was arranging white lilies meant for another woman's vows when the Duke of Hawthorne stopped beside her and asked, quietly enough that the words seemed intended for her alone, whether she believed in fate. And the question struck Margaret Ashcombe with such unexpected force that for a moment the estate, the wedding, and even her carefully practiced composure fell away, leaving her acutely aware of the dangerous intimacy contained in being truly seen. She had come to Hawthorne Estate to serve, to plan, to remain unnoticed, and yet here he stood, Alistair Ravenshaw, Duke of Hawthorne, watching her as though the order of his life had shifted by a single degree, and she was the cause. Margaret lowered her eyes at once, instinctively returning to the habits that had kept her safe for years, and replied that belief was a luxury afforded to those with choices, not to those whose lives were shaped by duty. But even as she spoke, she sensed that the answer did not satisfy him, nor did it protect her from the weight of his attention. She was a lady's companion by necessity rather than ambition, valued for her discretion and competence, and her current charge was to ensure that Lady Clarissa Vale's wedding unfolded with seamless elegance, every detail reflecting the union of an ancient title and an impeccable lineage. It was not her place to be questioned about fate by the groom, nor to feel the unsettling awareness that his gaze lingered, as though searching for something he could not yet name. The estate itself hummed with preparation, servants moving in disciplined rhythm through corridors, scented with fresh polish and early blossoms, the air thick with anticipation and expectation. Margaret had overseen the arrival of linens, the timing of deliveries, the careful coordination of florists and musicians, all while maintaining the invisible presence expected of someone in her position. She had learned long ago that usefulness offered a form of protection, that excellence without visibility allowed a woman to exist without inviting scrutiny. Yet the Duke's question echoed in her thoughts as she continued her work, and she found herself replaying his tone, not commanding, not dismissive, but curious in a way that suggested restlessness beneath restraint. Alistair Ravenshaw was a man shaped by inheritance and obligation, his life mapped before he had learned to argue against it, and his engagement to Lady Clarissa Vale was regarded as both suitable and inevitable. Margaret had observed them together with professional neutrality, noting the absence of warmth without presuming to judge, and she reminded herself now that inevitability was not her concern. Her task was to prepare a wedding, not to consider the emotional architecture of the marriage it represented, and certainly not to wonder why the Duke had chosen to ask her a question that belonged to confession rather than ceremony. As she straightened the final arrangement and signaled for the servants to proceed, Margaret resolved to dismiss the moment as an anomaly, a lapse in propriety that would not be repeated. She did not yet understand that fate, whether believed in or not, had already begun to rearrange the careful order of her life, nor that the question he had asked would return to her again and again, reshaping every certainty she thought she possessed. Margaret resumed her duties with renewed precision the following morning, determined that the Duke's question would not linger in her manner or soften the edges of her professionalism, and yet she felt the faint, persistent awareness of being observed long before she confirmed that Alistair Ravenshaw stood at the far end of the gallery, listening as she issued calm instructions to the household steward regarding seating arrangements and delivery schedules. Hawthorne Estate responded to her presence with practiced efficiency, for she had already established herself as a quiet authority, someone whose requests required no repetition, whose calm never faltered even as the weight of the approaching wedding pressed upon every corridor and chamber. She moved through the house with measured grace, her slate, blue gown chosen for utility rather than notice, her expression composed, her thoughts carefully disciplined, reminding herself that a woman in her position survived by making herself indispensable yet unremarkable. Lady Clarissa Vale arrived shortly before noon, her entrance marked by elegance rather than warmth, her pale silk traveling cloak immaculate, her expression pleasant and distant in equal measure. Margaret greeted her with respectful attentiveness, guiding her through the day's planned discussions, the fittings, the menu, confirmations, the final selections meant to signal harmony and abundance to a society that demanded visual certainty above all else. Clarissa listened politely, offering agreement where expected, suggestions where appropriate, yet Margaret could not ignore the subtle absence of anticipation in her tone, the way her gaze drifted toward windows rather than toward visions of her future. Still, Margaret did not presume familiarity, offering reassurance without intrusion, loyalty without judgment, for it was not her role to question the emotional foundation of the marriage she had been entrusted to prepare. The Duke joined them briefly, his presence altering the atmosphere without a single word spoken, and Margaret noted, with quiet unease, how readily his attention returned to her, as though she anchored the room more firmly than the woman he was set to marry. He asked practical questions, his voice controlled, his posture impeccable, yet his eyes lingered with the same thoughtful intensity that had unsettled her the day before. Margaret responded efficiently, keeping her tone neutral, her gaze appropriately lowered, and when Clarissa excused herself to attend another obligation, the Duke remained behind, commenting on Margaret's organizational acumen with a sincerity that felt uncomfortably personal. She acknowledged the remark with restrained courtesy, subtly redirecting the conversation back to logistics, reminding herself that admiration, even when sincere, was not invitation, and that her role required boundaries as firm as stone. Yet as he listened to her explanations, asking for her opinion rather than issuing directives, Margaret felt the faint destabilization of being regarded as more than function. The Duke's engagement, so publicly secure, seemed privately fragile in these moments, and Margaret became acutely aware of the danger inherent in being consulted, not merely as staff but as a thinking, feeling presence. By the time she retired to her small chamber to review the evening's schedule, Margaret understood that the wedding preparations were no longer the only delicate structure she was balancing. Something subtle had shifted, and though nothing improper had occurred, she sensed that maintaining order would now require more than competence. It would demand vigilance of the heart, a discipline far more difficult than any she had mastered before. Margaret became aware of the fractures, not through any single revelation, but through accumulation, through the quiet details that revealed themselves when one was accustomed to observing without being observed, and as the days unfolded she noted how Lady Clarissa's laughter never lingered beyond its polite offering, how the Duke's silences lengthened rather than softened in her presence, and how the household itself seemed to hold its breath whenever the two occupied the same room. These were not the signs of discord that invited intervention, only the subtle absence of ease, the kind that went unnoticed by those invested in appearances, but spoke clearly to someone whose life had been shaped by watching rather than acting. Margaret carried out her responsibilities with unwavering diligence, guiding preparations with calm authority, yet she found herself increasingly conscious of the Duke's attention in moments when he believed himself unobserved. His gaze followed her progress through a room not with ownership or expectation, but with an intensity that suggested inquiry, as though he were trying to understand how someone so central to the smooth functioning of his household had escaped his notice until now. When their paths crossed, his questions extended beyond necessity, touching upon her preferences, her judgments, her view of arrangements that carried symbolic weight, and each time Margaret responded with careful balance, offering insight without intimacy, substance without invitation. She reminded herself repeatedly that awareness was not attachment, that being seen did not require being claimed, yet the truth unsettled her all the same. For years she had existed within a structure that valued her invisibility, that rewarded restraint and punished desire, and she had accepted this arrangement with a composure born of experience rather than bitterness. To be regarded now, not as an extension of duty but as a person whose thoughts mattered, disrupted the equilibrium she had worked so carefully to maintain. Clarissa, for her part, remained gracious and correct, but Margaret noticed the way her attention drifted during discussions of the future, the way her enthusiasm surfaced only when conversation strayed from the subject of marriage itself. There was no cruelty in her demeanor, no manipulation, only a quiet resignation that Margaret recognized too well. It was the posture of someone who had chosen safety over longing, believing the choice irrevocable. The Duke's presence weighed differently on Margaret with each passing day. He did not touch her, did not speak out of turn, did nothing that could be named as impropriety, yet she sensed his awareness pressing against the boundaries she had drawn so carefully. When he sought her opinion, he listened fully, and when she spoke, he did not interrupt, and this alone marked a departure from the way men of his position typically engaged those beneath them. Margaret felt the danger not in scandal but in recognition, in the quiet understanding that once a person was truly seen, it became impossible to retreat unchanged. By evening, as she reviewed correspondence and schedules, Margaret acknowledged what she had tried to dismiss. The engagement was not the only fragile structure within Hawthorne Estate. Something unnamed was taking shape beneath the surface of duty and decorum, and though she had no intention of giving it form, she feared that restraint alone might not be enough to prevent its becoming real. The planning meeting had been intended as a formality, a necessary alignment of final details before invitations were dispatched and the estate surrendered fully to expectation. Yet the moment Margaret found herself seated across from the Duke in the quiet withdrawing room, she sensed that the conversation would not unfold as cleanly as the agenda suggested. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes in its path, and the stillness of the space heightened every sound: the soft scrape of paper, the measured cadence of his voice, as he reviewed arrangements with a precision that matched her own. She responded with clarity and efficiency, noting adjustments, confirming timelines, maintaining the professional rhythm that had always protected her. But she became aware almost immediately that his questions were changing in nature, drifting from logistics towards something less defined and far more dangerous. He asked why she preferred certain arrangements over others, not in the tone of correction but of genuine curiosity, and when she explained her reasoning, he listened as though her perspective carried weight beyond its utility. The discussion widened, touching upon symbolism, tradition, and the quiet messages conveyed by ceremony, and before Margaret could redirect it, he asked her what she believed made a marriage endure once the spectacle had passed. The question was not improper, yet it struck too close to territory she had learned to avoid, and she answered carefully, speaking of mutual respect, shared purpose, and the discipline of choosing one another daily, all while remaining acutely aware that her words were being absorbed with an intensity that unsettled her. The Duke leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded, and spoke of responsibility with a candor that surprised her, acknowledging the weight of expectations placed upon him since boyhood and the inevitability of choices made long before consent was possible. His voice remained controlled, but beneath it Margaret sensed fatigue, a restlessness that mirrored her own in ways she did not wish to acknowledge. She responded with restraint, offering understanding without encouragement, reminding him gently that duty, when embraced with integrity, could offer its own form of meaning. Yet even as she spoke, she recognized the fragility of the boundary she was attempting to preserve. The silence that followed carried more significance than any declaration might have, and when their eyes met, Margaret felt the full risk of being understood without disguise. She lowered her gaze at once, grounding herself in propriety, gathering her papers with deliberate calm, and suggested they conclude the meeting, citing remaining preparations that required her attention. The Duke did not protest, but she sensed his reluctance, the sense that something essential had nearly surfaced and been deliberately submerged. As she left the room, Margaret understood with unwelcome clarity that restraint was no longer simply a habit but an active defense, one that would require constant vigilance. The planning of a wedding had placed her in proximity to a man whose questions challenged the careful order of her life, and though nothing had been confessed or promised, she felt the quiet certainty that the distance between them was narrowing in ways neither schedule nor silence could fully contain. Margaret found herself waking earlier than necessary in the days that followed, her mind stirring before the household bell, thoughts already aligning themselves into lists and contingencies, as though order alone could keep unease at bay. And as she dressed in the half-light of morning, she reflected, not for the first time, on how thoroughly her life had been shaped by adaptation rather than choice. There had been a time, long ago enough to feel almost theoretical now, when her future had seemed malleable, when education and gentle encouragement had hinted at possibilities beyond service, but circumstance had narrowed those paths with quiet efficiency, and Margaret had learned to accept usefulness as both purpose and shield. It was safer to be necessary than desired, safer to manage than to hope, and she had built her composure on that understanding with deliberate care. Yet, as she moved through Hawthorne Estate, checking deliveries, reviewing correspondence, and guiding servants with calm authority, she sensed the Duke's awareness again, subtle but unmistakable, and though he did not interrupt her work, she knew he was observing the way the household responded to her presence, the ease with which order followed her instructions, the respect she commanded without demand. Alistair Ravenshaw had been raised to command loyalty through title alone, but he was not blind to competence, and Margaret could feel his growing recognition of her as something more than an efficient intermediary. When their paths crossed, his gaze carried a quiet attentiveness that unsettled her more than overt interest might have, for it suggested consideration rather than impulse. She reminded herself that attention did not equate to intention, that men of his position often sought intellectual diversion in conversation without consequence, yet the awareness lingered all the same. In moments when she believed herself unobserved, she caught him watching her not as one might observe a servant fulfilling a role, but as though measuring the steadiness of something newly discovered. The realization unsettled her, stirring a faint, unwelcome sense of vulnerability, for to be noticed in this way threatened the careful invisibility she had cultivated. Margaret countered the sensation by redoubling her discipline, keeping her manner impeccably formal, her responses precise and contained, yet she could not entirely dismiss the subtle shift in the way he addressed her, the absence of condescension, the presence of consideration. It forced her to confront an uncomfortable truth she had long avoided, that she had accepted limitation not only because it was imposed, but because it had protected her from the risk of wanting more than she could claim. As the day wore on, she overheard Clarissa's soft laughter drifting from a distant corridor, light and practiced, and the contrast struck her with unexpected force. Clarissa was kind, composed, and perfectly suited to the role she was expected to fulfill, yet Margaret sensed the quiet resignation beneath her elegance, a mirror of her own in a different form. Both women, in their own ways, had learned to live within confines shaped by expectation rather than desire. By evening, as Margaret reviewed final arrangements in her chamber, she acknowledged with reluctant honesty that something within Hawthorne Estate was shifting, not through declaration or defiance, but through recognition. The Duke was beginning to see her not merely as a function of the wedding, and she feared that if this continued, usefulness would no longer be sufficient protection. For the first time in years, Margaret felt the unsettling pull of significance, and with it, the realization that remaining unseen might no longer be possible, nor entirely desired. Lady Clarissa requested Margaret's presence in the late afternoon, summoning her not to discuss schedules or fittings but to walk slowly along the eastern corridor where tall windows overlooked the gardens, and from the first measured steps, Margaret sensed that this conversation would not belong to logistics. Clarissa spoke with the same composure she wore so naturally, yet there was an unusual carefulness in her tone, as though she were selecting words not for elegance but for survival, and she confessed, without drama or self-pity, that she felt curiously unprepared for the life she was about to enter, not because she doubted her capacity to fulfill it, but because she could not summon the feelings society insisted must accompany such a union. She asked Margaret whether marriage inevitably required affection, or whether steadiness and respect might suffice, and Margaret listened with the full attention she offered only when something fragile had been placed in her care. She answered honestly but gently, acknowledging that many lives were built upon duty rather than devotion, yet she did not disguise the quiet cost of such choices, nor did she romanticize endurance as virtue. Clarissa received this without defensiveness, nodding as though the truth confirmed something she had long suspected but never named, and for a moment the two women stood together in shared restraint, bound by an understanding neither would voice aloud. The Duke's approach was unannounced, his presence registering first as a shift in the air rather than sound, and when he joined them, Clarissa's expression settled instantly back into polished serenity, the vulnerability she had shown Margaret retreating behind practiced grace. He inquired politely after their progress, his tone measured, yet Margaret sensed the subtle tension beneath his composure, the awareness that something significant had passed just beyond his reach. Clarissa excused herself shortly thereafter, leaving Margaret alone with him in the corridor, the light stretching long across the floor as though marking the distance between what could be spoken and what must remain contained. The Duke remarked upon Margaret's patience, observing that she seemed to possess an uncommon steadiness, and though the comment was mild, it carried an intimacy that unsettled her more than overt praise might have done. She responded with modest deflection, emphasizing Clarissa's composure and suitability, reaffirming her loyalty without hesitation, yet she felt the weight of unspoken truths, pressing against the careful order she had maintained. As the Duke departed, Margaret remained by the window for a moment longer, steadying herself against the realization that she now held knowledge that complicated her role in ways she could not ignore. Clarissa's confession echoed in her thoughts, not as scandal but as mirror, revealing how many lives were shaped by quiet surrender rather than choice. Margaret returned to her duties with renewed discipline, yet beneath her composure lay the growing awareness that she stood at the center of an emotional convergence she had never sought. She understood now that loyalty did not always align neatly with honesty, and that her integrity would soon demand more than silence. The wedding preparations continued with their usual precision, but Margaret sensed with quiet certainty that something essential had shifted, and that the order she so carefully preserved might soon require a reckoning no amount of competence could indefinitely delay. Margaret began to sense the danger not in any single exchange, but in the growing frequency with which the Duke sought her counsel, and though each conversation could be defended as practical or necessary, taken together, they formed a pattern that unsettled her more than overt impropriety ever could. He asked her opinion on matters that extended beyond ceremony, inquiring how best to address a steward's mistake, how to balance tradition with the realities of the household, how authority might be exercised without fostering resentment, and each time he listened with an attentiveness that suggested her words mattered beyond the moment. Margaret responded with care, offering measured insight while guarding against familiarity, yet she could not deny the subtle intimacy created by being trusted in this way, by knowing that her perspective shaped decisions within a life so distant from her own station. She countered the growing closeness with discipline, limiting her presence where possible, excusing herself once her role had been fulfilled, retreating into formality whenever conversation threatened to linger. And yet the Duke seemed to notice the shift, his questions growing quieter, his pauses longer, as though he sensed the deliberate space she was creating. In those moments, Margaret felt the strain of maintaining boundaries against someone who had done nothing to violate them, and she reminded herself that restraint was not punishment but preservation, the only means by which she could remain honorable without unraveling the life she had built. Internally, the conflict sharpened. Margaret understood that emotional intimacy did not require touch or confession, that it could grow quietly through recognition and shared restraint, and this understanding frightened her more than longing itself. She had spent years believing that desire was dangerous because it led to disappointment, but she was beginning to see that being understood posed its own risk, one that threatened the invisibility she had relied upon for survival. The Duke's presence no longer felt neutral. It carried weight, expectation without demand, awareness without claim, and she found herself measuring her words not only for propriety but for consequence. The household, sensitive to unspoken shifts, began to respond in subtle ways. Servants deferred to Margaret with increased attentiveness, and she sensed curiosity in glances that lingered a fraction too long, the quiet speculation that arose whenever established rhythms altered. Margaret tightened her composure in response, becoming more precise, more restrained, determined that no rumor could take root through her conduct. She refused herself even private indulgence, reminding her own heart that acknowledgement did not grant permission. The Duke, meanwhile, grew more introspective, his demeanor marked by a quiet tension that suggested unresolved thought rather than indecision. He watched Margaret with a seriousness that unsettled her, as though aware that something essential was slipping beyond his grasp, not through loss but through denial. When their eyes met, neither looked away immediately, and in that brief pause Margaret felt the full weight of choice pressing against her carefully maintained life. By evening, as she reviewed correspondence alone, Margaret recognized with reluctant clarity that the danger she feared was no longer theoretical. Emotional proximity had taken root, despite her vigilance, and she understood that distance, once lost, could not be easily reclaimed. The question was no longer whether she could maintain restraint, but whether restraint alone would be enough to preserve her integrity when understanding had already altered the ground beneath her feet. The formal dinner was arranged to affirm unity, a carefully constructed display meant to reassure visiting relations and neighboring families that the approaching marriage rested upon harmony and shared purpose. Yet from the moment the guests assembled, Margaret sensed the strain beneath the polished surface. The long table gleamed beneath candlelight, silver and crystal arranged with exacting symmetry, and Margaret moved through the final moments of preparation with practiced calm, adjusting a place setting here, murmuring a reminder there, her presence efficient and unobtrusive. She took her position along the wall once the guests were seated, as expected, yet even from that distance she could feel the Duke's discomfort settling over the table like an unspoken weight. Alistair Ravenshaw sat beside Lady Clarissa with impeccable courtesy, his posture flawless, his conversation precise, yet there was a rigidity to his movements that betrayed effort rather than ease. Clarissa responded with grace, her smile serene, her remarks appropriate, but Margaret observed the way her attention drifted toward the guests rather than toward the man at her side. It was Margaret, unexpectedly, who seemed to anchor the Duke's focus. His gaze lifted toward her more than once, brief and controlled, yet unmistakably drawn, and each time she met it by chance, she felt the faint tightening of awareness that came with being seen when one least wished it. Others noticed as well. Margaret became conscious of glances exchanged across the table, of pauses that lingered a fraction too long, of the subtle recalibration that occurred when social instincts detected a deviation from expectation. She responded by stilling herself further, moderating every expression, every movement, reminding herself that visibility was not safety. When she was required to approach the table to clarify a detail with the steward, the Duke addressed her with ease and attentiveness that contrasted sharply with the formality of his interactions elsewhere, and though his words were unremarkable, the manner in which he listened carried an intimacy that did not escape notice. Clarissa's awareness sharpened as the evening progressed. Her smile remained intact, but Margaret sensed a coolness enter her gaze whenever the Duke's attention strayed. There was no accusation, no breach of decorum, only the quiet assertion of boundaries reinforced through precision. Margaret received the signal clearly and adjusted her conduct accordingly, withdrawing into the periphery, offering nothing that could be misinterpreted, even as she felt the unease of being positioned, however unwillingly, within a dynamic she had never sought. The Duke appeared increasingly ill at ease as the meal continued, his responses slower, his composure more deliberate, as though every word required calculation. Margaret recognized the signs of a man confronting an internal dissonance he could neither name nor resolve in public, and she felt an unexpected pang of empathy tempered by caution. Understanding did not grant permission, and compassion did not erase consequence. When the final course was served and the guests began to disperse, Margaret exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding. The dinner had confirmed what she had tried to dismiss, that emotional truth could not be fully concealed beneath etiquette, and that her presence, once neutral, now carried significance beyond her control. As she withdrew to attend to the household's closing duties, Margaret understood that distance alone would no longer suffice. The pattern had been noticed, and from this moment forward, every interaction would carry weight, whether she acknowledged it or not. The shift in Lady Clarissa's demeanor revealed itself not through confrontation but through refinement, a tightening of courtesy so precise it could not be mistaken for accident, and Margaret felt it keenly as the days following the dinner unfolded with a new, unmistakable restraint. Clarissa remained gracious, her requests polite, her tone measured, yet there was now a deliberate clarity to her interactions, as though invisible lines had been carefully redrawn, and Margaret was expected to recognize them without explanation. Margaret did so at once, responding with increased formality, ensuring that every exchange remained irreproachably professional, her loyalty unmistakable in both word and conduct. Yet the very care she exercised only heightened her awareness of how fragile her position had become. The household seemed attuned to the subtle recalibration, servants glancing up more quickly when she entered a room, conversations pausing with slightly too much care. Margaret countered this by becoming even more precise, arriving early, departing promptly, offering no opinions unless explicitly requested, determined that no ambiguity could be traced to her behavior. She reminded herself that reputation was preserved not through intention but through perception, and that she could not afford even the appearance of impropriety. The Duke, for his part, grew quieter. Where he had once sought Margaret's counsel with thoughtful regularity, he now hesitated, as though weighing the cost of each interaction. When they did speak, his tone remained courteous, his words restrained, yet Margaret sensed the tension beneath his composure, the effort required to maintain distance where ease had once existed. Their exchanges became brief and deliberate, shaped by mutual awareness rather than comfort, and though Margaret welcomed the reduction in intimacy, she could not deny the ache of something deliberately withheld. Internally, the strain deepened. Margaret recognized with unwelcome clarity that remaining near the Duke carried risk regardless of her intentions, yet withdrawal felt equally perilous, suggesting guilt where none existed. She found herself navigating not only her own conscience, but the expectations of a household trained to read meaning into silence. The cost of proximity became increasingly apparent, and she began to understand that even unspoken attachment altered the balance of power in ways she could not fully control. Clarissa's composure never faltered, but Margaret sensed the quiet resolve beneath it, a determination to preserve dignity above all else. There was no cruelty in her restraint, only the careful assertion of position, and Margaret respected it deeply. If anything, the shift reinforced her loyalty, reminding her that Clarissa had placed trust in her without reservation, a trust that could not be repaid with carelessness of the heart. By the time Margaret retired to her chamber that evening, she acknowledged the truth she had resisted for too long. Neutrality was no longer possible. Her presence now influenced the emotional landscape of Hawthorne Estate whether she wished it or not, and the danger lay not in scandal but in consequence. She understood then that the path ahead would demand choice rather than endurance, and that the cost of remaining where she was might soon outweigh the cost of leaving, however quietly she did so. The Duke sought her out in the early evening, not with summons or ceremony, but by waiting in the smaller library where the windows faced west and the light softened the edges of everything it touched. And when Margaret entered to deliver updated notes on the final arrangements, she sensed at once that this conversation would not remain confined to schedules. Alistair Ravenshaw received the papers without comment, gesturing for her to sit, a familiarity he checked almost immediately, as though aware of how even small liberties now carried weight. She remained standing, choosing formality where uncertainty hovered, and it was that choice, she later realized, that prompted him to speak with a candor he had thus far restrained. He thanked her first, not for her efficiency but for her discernment, acknowledging how often her judgment had steadied matters beyond the scope of ceremony, and though his tone was measured, Margaret heard beneath it the strain of a man unused to speaking of reliance. He spoke then of inheritance, of expectations laid upon him before he had learned to question them, of how the future had always appeared fixed, shaped by lineage rather than inclination. His words were careful, never crossing into complaint, yet Margaret sensed the loneliness threaded through them, the quiet cost of a life lived in alignment with duty rather than desire. Margaret listened without interruption, aware that this trust was not lightly given. She responded with honesty tempered by restraint, speaking of responsibility as something that could be carried with integrity, yet acknowledging that endurance without fulfillment exacted its own toll. She did not speak of love, nor of fate, nor of longing, but she did not pretend that obligation alone satisfied the deeper needs of the human heart. The Duke absorbed her words in silence, his expression unreadable, yet something in his posture eased, as though the simple act of being understood had lessened a burden he had long carried alone. For a moment, the room held a fragile equilibrium, balanced between what had been spoken and what remained unacknowledged, and Margaret felt the familiar tightening of awareness that now accompanied such moments. She reminded herself that compassion was not permission, that understanding did not grant entitlement, and she drew the conversation gently back toward practical matters, reaffirming the boundaries that protected them both. The Duke did not resist the shift, though she sensed his reluctance, the unspoken desire to linger where honesty had briefly flourished. When she took her leave, Margaret felt altered in a way she could not easily define. The exchange had not been improper, nor had it breached decorum, yet it had deepened something already precarious. She understood now that the Duke's unease was not rooted in uncertainty about the marriage alone, but in a broader reckoning with the life he had accepted without question. That she had been the one to witness this awareness unsettled her more than the confession itself. As she returned to her duties, Margaret recognized the danger with painful clarity. Being trusted in this way bound her to an emotional truth she could neither claim nor dismiss, and she sensed that the careful balance she had maintained was nearing its limit. The wedding advanced with relentless certainty, yet beneath its ordered progress, something essential was beginning to fracture, and Margaret knew that once broken, it could not be restored by silence alone. The error revealed itself late in the day, small in origin but expansive in consequence, a miscommunication between suppliers that left a crucial delivery delayed beyond correction unless addressed at once, and Margaret found herself remaining long after the household had settled, candles lit low in the estate offices, as she recalculated schedules and dictated revisions with calm efficiency. The Duke joined her without announcement, having dismissed his attendants earlier than usual, and though neither commented on the hour, the quiet that surrounded them felt different from the charged silences they had grown accustomed to, less guarded, more exposed. Papers lay spread between them, the practical problem anchoring their proximity, and for a time they worked in focused accord, their movements synchronized by necessity rather than choice. As the matter resolved, conversation lingered where it might once have ended, drifting into reflection not through intention but through fatigue, the careful walls of formality softened by the lateness of the hour. The Duke spoke of irrevocable decisions, of how easily one might mistake inevitability for wisdom, and though his tone remained restrained, Margaret sensed the depth of the reckoning beneath his words. She answered with quiet resolve, speaking of the discipline of choosing endurance when options narrowed, of how survival often required acceptance rather than rebellion, yet she did not disguise the cost of such choices. Her honesty was measured, stripped of sentiment, and precisely because of that it carried weight, drawing his attention in a way neither could ignore. The room seemed to contract around them, candlelight casting long shadows across ledgers and polished wood, and Margaret became acutely aware of the risk inherent in the moment, not because of what had been said, but because of what hovered just beyond speech. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to retreat rising sharply, and she gathered the papers with deliberate calm, signaling the end of the work as she had learned to do in moments of emotional threat. The Duke watched her closely, understanding passing between them without articulation, and for an instant Margaret feared he might speak the truth she was determined not to invite. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging the boundary she had drawn, and thanked her with a gravity that felt like restraint rather than dismissal. They parted without ceremony, the door closing softly behind her, and as Margaret walked the dim corridor toward her chamber, she recognized the shift that had occurred despite her vigilance. Something essential had been shared in the quiet hours, something that could not be undone by silence or propriety. Alone, she removed the pins from her hair with unhurried precision, grounding herself in routine, yet her thoughts refused order. She understood now that avoidance was no longer sufficient, that the closeness she feared had already taken root through shared truth rather than transgression. The danger lay not in confession but in recognition, and Margaret knew with steady certainty that the path ahead would demand more than discipline. The wedding continued its approach, fixed and unquestioned, yet beneath its careful progress, a fault line had formed, and she sensed that when it shifted, the life she had built through endurance alone would no longer hold. Clarissa's announcement came the following morning with impeccable composure, delivered over tea as though it concerned linen textures rather than the symbolic heart of a ceremony meant to define a lifetime. She proposed alterations to the wedding that were elaborate in appearance yet curiously hollow in meaning, additional floral displays, extended processions, carefully staged moments designed to impress rather than reflect, and as Margaret listened, she felt a quiet dissonance settle within her. The changes were not unreasonable, nor were they excessive by society's standards, but they carried the unmistakable quality of performance, as though beauty itself were being asked to compensate for something unspoken and absent. Margaret responded as duty required, making careful notes, offering measured suggestions, confirming feasibility without commentary, yet internally she questioned the integrity of her role in facilitating a spectacle so clearly divorced from emotional truth. She had long accepted that weddings were often shaped more by expectation than intimacy, but this felt different, not merely conventional but compensatory, an effort to drown uncertainty beneath ornamentation. Clarissa's tone remained serene throughout, her expression calm, yet Margaret sensed beneath it a resolve that bordered on resignation, a determination to fulfill the role assigned to her with flawless execution regardless of personal cost. The Duke was informed later that afternoon, and his reaction, though restrained, revealed his growing unease. He listened without interruption, his posture composed, but Margaret observed the subtle tightening of his jaw, the slight pause before assent, the manner in which he accepted the changes, as one might accept an obligation rather than a choice. When Clarissa departed, he remained seated longer than necessary, staring at nothing in particular, and for a moment Margaret feared he would speak, that he would turn to her and voice the questions he had thus far contained. Instead, he thanked her for her continued diligence and excused himself, leaving behind a silence heavy with implication. Alone, Margaret felt the weight of her conscience press more firmly than before. She was efficient, trusted, respected, yet she could no longer deny the ethical tension inherent in her position. To do her work well now meant enabling a union she increasingly believed would demand quiet sacrifice from both parties, a marriage shaped by obligation rather than mutual recognition. She reminded herself that judgment was not her right, that her role was to serve, not to intervene, yet the reassurance rang hollow. Integrity, she realized, was not preserved by silence alone. As she oversaw the implementation of the new arrangements, Margaret felt a subtle shift within herself, a loosening of the certainty that had once steadied her. She was no longer merely organizing a ceremony. She was participating in the construction of a narrative she did not believe. The realization unsettled her deeply, forcing her to confront the cost of competence divorced from conviction. By evening, as she reviewed the revised plans, Margaret acknowledged what she had tried to avoid. The wedding had become a symbol not of unity, but of avoidance, and her skill, once a source of pride, now felt uncomfortably close to complicity. She understood then that remaining neutral would soon require her to deny a truth she could no longer ignore, and that the choice before her was no longer between discretion and desire, but between endurance and integrity. Margaret became aware of the change in herself not through longing, but through anticipation, a subtle alertness that preceded reason and unsettled her more than desire ever could. She found herself listening for the cadence of the Duke's steps in the corridor, recognizing his presence before it announced itself, and though she corrected the instinct at once, the awareness lingered, persistent and unwelcome. She countered it with discipline, returning to routines that had once anchored her with certainty, yet even prayer felt altered now, not weakened, but sharpened by questions she had never before permitted herself to ask. She reminded herself that emotional vigilance was not indulgence but necessity, that survival within rigid structures depended upon restraint rather than hope, and yet restraint began to feel increasingly like a form of erasure. Each interaction with the Duke, however brief, carried an undercurrent she could no longer dismiss as coincidence. His silences lengthened in her presence, his focus drifting during discussions with Clarissa, and Margaret sensed the effort required to maintain composure where ease no longer existed. She refused to interpret these signs as invitation, reminding herself that awareness did not confer claim, but the refusal itself grew more strenuous with each passing day. The Duke, for his part, appeared altered by a restlessness he did not attempt to conceal. His movements carried a deliberation that suggested constant calculation, and Margaret observed the way his attention lingered on empty spaces, as though measuring absence rather than presence. When he addressed her, his tone remained correct, his words carefully chosen, yet she sensed the strain beneath them, the weight of thoughts unresolved. He did not seek her counsel as frequently, as though aware that proximity now carried risk, yet when necessity required it, their exchanges were marked by a gravity that neither could ignore. Margaret's internal conflict sharpened into something more defined, no longer vague unease but a steady pressure against the identity she had constructed through years of acceptance. She had believed herself immune to longing, fortified by practicality and experience, yet she was beginning to understand that significance, once encountered, could not be unlearned. To be regarded as more than function threatened the safety she had cultivated, and she feared that acknowledging the change within herself would dismantle the discipline that had sustained her. She sought solace in structure, overseeing preparations with increased precision, her demeanor unassailable, her authority quietly reaffirmed through competence. Yet even as the wedding advanced toward completion, Margaret sensed the growing dissonance between the order she imposed and the disorder beneath it. The ceremony was taking shape with relentless certainty, every detail refined, every expectation met, and still she felt the quiet certainty that its foundation was unsound. By evening, alone in her chamber, Margaret acknowledged with reluctant honesty that prayer no longer offered reassurance so much as clarity. She could endure almost anything, she realized, but endurance demanded meaning to remain intact. Without it, restraint became hollow, and discipline turned against itself. The Duke's unrest mirrored her own in ways she could no longer dismiss, and though she resisted the implication, she understood that something essential was approaching a turning point. The danger was no longer that she might want what she could not claim. It was that she was beginning to see herself as someone capable of wanting it all, and once that truth had been admitted, even in silence, the careful life she had built could not remain unchanged. The outing was intended to be unremarkable, a necessary visit to finalize arrangements with a family long connected to Hawthorne estate, yet from the moment Margaret stepped into the carriage, she sensed the fragile balance she had worked so carefully to maintain shifting once more beneath her feet. The Duke accompanied Lady Clarissa as expected, his manner impeccable, his attention outwardly focused on courtesy and conversation, and Margaret positioned herself with deliberate discretion, mindful of both propriety and perception. The countryside passed in quiet rhythm, the motion of the carriage steady, but the atmosphere within felt taut, as though every unspoken thought pressed against restraint. At the estate, they were received with polite warmth, conversation flowing easily among the assembled company, and Margaret resumed her role with practiced ease, guiding details, answering questions, ensuring the visit unfolded smoothly. Yet she could not ignore the Duke's attentiveness, the way his gaze followed her movements with an alertness that bordered on protectiveness. When a minor confusion arose regarding timing, he intervened without hesitation, deferring to her judgment publicly and with unmistakable confidence. The gesture was brief, easily justified, yet its effect rippled outward, drawing notice from those attuned to nuance. Margaret felt the awareness at once, the subtle shift in how others regarded her, the glances exchanged, the slight recalibration of social instinct that followed perceived significance. She responded instinctively, tightening her composure, limiting her speech, ensuring her conduct remained beyond reproach. Yet the Duke's presence near her felt deliberate, his proximity a quiet assertion that unsettled her more than overt attention ever could. She sensed his awareness of her unease, yet he did not withdraw, as though some instinct overrode caution. Clarissa observed it all with serene composure, her expression calm, her posture unassailable, yet when she later addressed Margaret privately, her tone carried a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. She spoke courteously, thanking Margaret for her diligence, remarking upon how indispensable she had become, and in those carefully chosen words, Margaret recognized a boundary being redrawn. There was no accusation, no reproach, only the subtle assertion of position, and Margaret received it with humility, reaffirming her loyalty with quiet firmness. The encounter left her shaken not by censure, but by clarity. Clarissa's restraint underscored the reality Margaret had tried to ignore, that her presence now carried consequence beyond her control. Loyalty demanded more than good intention. It demanded awareness of impact, and Margaret felt the weight of that responsibility settle heavily upon her. As the visit concluded, and the carriage returned toward Hawthorne, Margaret sat in composed silence, her thoughts steady but resolute. The Duke remained attentive, his manner protective without intrusion, yet she felt the cost of that protection keenly. By the time they reached the estate, she understood with painful certainty that discretion alone would no longer suffice. She had become visible in ways she could not undo, and the danger now lay not in misunderstanding, but in remaining where clarity demanded change. The thought of departure took shape slowly, not as impulse, but as inevitability, settling into Margaret's mind with the quiet persistence of a truth long resisted, and as the days unfolded, she found herself considering logistics with the same precision she applied to every duty, calculating what might be concluded, what could be delegated, and how little disruption her absence might cause once the wedding was complete. Leaving had never frightened her. She had done it before, adapting to new households with practiced composure, yet this time the idea carried a different weight, not loss of position but relinquishment of something unnamed that had begun to matter despite her vigilance. She mentioned the possibility only once, and even then with careful detachment, noting to the housekeeper that she would likely seek a new placement following the ceremony, a natural transition given the conclusion of her charge. The comment was unremarkable, easily dismissed, yet it reached the Duke with unexpected speed, and when he sought her out later that evening, Margaret sensed at once that something essential had shifted. He did not summon her formally, nor did he disguise his intent behind routine inquiry. He simply asked whether it was true, his voice controlled but unsteady beneath the restraint. Margaret answered honestly, explaining that her role would soon be complete, that it was customary for a lady's companion to move on once her service had fulfilled its purpose. She spoke calmly, framing the decision as practical rather than personal, yet she could not ignore the effect her words had upon him. The Duke's composure faltered, his silence stretching longer than etiquette required, and when he finally spoke, it was not to challenge her reasoning but to question, with quiet intensity, why the prospect unsettled him so deeply. The admission startled them both. Margaret felt the familiar instinct to retreat rise sharply, yet she held her ground, reminding him gently of propriety, of the necessity of maintaining order where emotions threatened disruption. She emphasized Clarissa's impending place as mistress of the estate, the importance of stability, the wisdom of continuity. The Duke listened, but his attention remained fixed upon her, as though the future she described felt suddenly abstract compared to the absence her departure implied. When the conversation ended, nothing had been resolved, yet the space between them felt irrevocably altered. Margaret returned to her chamber with steady steps, her thoughts disciplined yet strained, and acknowledged what she had not permitted herself to consider before. Her presence had mattered more than she had allowed herself to believe, not as convenience but as constancy, and the realization unsettled her deeply. That night, sleep came slowly. Margaret lay awake, staring into darkness, aware that departure, once conceived as solution, now carried its own cost. Leaving might preserve propriety, might restore balance, but it would also confirm the truth neither had spoken aloud, that something of value would be lost. She understood then that the choice before her was no longer simply about duty, but about whether absence could truly resolve what recognition had already brought into being, and the answer, though unwelcome, felt increasingly clear. Dusk settled gently over the gardens, softening the sharp lines of the hedges and drawing long shadows across the gravel paths, and it was there, away from the corridors and the watching eyes of the household that Margaret encountered the Duke by quiet coincidence rather than design. He stood near the old stone balustrade, hands resting lightly against the cool surface, as though grounding himself, and for a moment neither spoke, the stillness carrying more weight than conversation ever could. The air was scented with earth and fading blooms, the day relinquishing its hold with deliberate calm, and Margaret felt the strange sense that time itself had slowed, allowing room for truths that daylight discouraged. It was the Duke who broke the silence, not by naming what lay between them, but by asking whether she believed that a life was shaped more by choice than by fate. The question echoed the one he had asked days before, yet now it carried deeper resonance, stripped of curiosity and edged with urgency. Margaret answered carefully, as she had learned to do, acknowledging that fate often provided circumstances, but that choice determined how one lived within them. Her voice was steady, yet she felt the quiet tremor beneath her composure, the awareness that each word mattered more than she wished. He spoke then of duty, of how often it was mistaken for destiny, of the danger of confusing expectation with inevitability, and Margaret sensed how close he stood to naming what he still resisted. She responded not with encouragement, but with clarity, reminding him that choice carried consequence, that altering one path inevitably reshaped many others. The exchange hovered on the edge of confession, each sentence circling truth without touching it, and Margaret felt the pull of honesty press hard against restraint. The fading light deepened, the sky shifting toward indigo, and in that quiet moment Margaret understood with aching certainty that they stood at a threshold neither could cross without cost. She could feel the question forming in him, could sense the unspoken appeal beneath his restraint, and she recognized the danger not as scandal but as surrender, the kind that altered lives beyond repair. With deliberate resolve, she stepped back, reasserting distance not through coldness but through choice, reminding him gently that some lines, once crossed, could not be redrawn. The Duke accepted the boundary with visible effort, his expression tightening briefly before settling once more into control. He did not protest, did not argue, and that restraint unsettled Margaret more than defiance might have. When they parted, it was without promise or declaration, only a shared understanding that something essential had been acknowledged and set aside. As Margaret walked back toward the house, the garden paths dim beneath her steps, she felt both relief and grief settle within her. The moment had passed without transgression, yet it had changed her all the same. Fate, she realized, was not an external force but an accumulation of choices, each one narrowing or widening the future. And though she had chosen restraint, she knew with quiet certainty that the question he had asked would not release her easily, nor would the path ahead remain as orderly as she once believed. Clarissa asked for Margaret's company that evening, with a politeness that carried none of the tension Margaret had come to anticipate, and when she entered Clarissa's sitting room, she sensed at once that this conversation would not concern flowers or schedules. The lamps were lit low, casting a gentle glow across the furnishings, and Clarissa stood near the window, her posture composed yet thoughtful, as though she had been standing there for some time, rehearsing words that resisted arrangement. She invited Margaret to sit, then did the same herself, folding her hands with deliberate care before speaking. She began without preamble, confessing that she had long known something was amiss within herself, not sudden doubt but a quiet absence she had ignored for years, believing it prudent rather than dangerous. Clarissa spoke of affection she had never fully allowed herself to acknowledge, a feeling formed long before her engagement, one she had chosen to bury beneath expectation and advantage. Her voice remained steady as she admitted that marrying the Duke had seemed sensible, safe, and honorable, yet she could not persuade herself that safety was the same as truth. Margaret listened with full attention, struck not by scandal but by the courage it took to name such restraint aloud. Clarissa did not accuse, nor did she seek reassurance. Instead, she spoke with reflective honesty, acknowledging that she had mistaken composure for certainty and endurance for conviction. She admitted that watching Margaret navigate her role with such integrity had forced her to confront the cost of silence, for it revealed how easily a woman could disappear within duty if she allowed herself to believe it was all she deserved. The admission startled Margaret, who had never imagined herself as catalyst rather than observer, and she felt the weight of that realization settle quietly between them. Margaret responded with compassion rather than advice, affirming Clarissa's dignity without encouraging rupture. She spoke of choice as something earned through clarity rather than impulse, and of the courage required not to seize happiness, but to refuse a life that demanded too much erasure. Clarissa received the words with thoughtful calm, nodding as though they aligned with a truth she had already reached on her own. The conversation ended without resolution, yet it left Margaret unsettled in a new way. Clarissa's confession reframed everything Margaret thought she understood about the engagement, revealing it not as imbalance, but as mutual restraint shaped by expectation rather than malice. It also awakened an unexpected tenderness within her, a fragile hope she did not trust herself to examine too closely. As Margaret departed, she realized that Clarissa's truth had altered the landscape irrevocably. What had once seemed fixed now appeared provisional, shaped by fear rather than inevitability. The realization did not offer relief so much as responsibility, and Margaret understood that she now carried knowledge that could not be unseen. Clarissa was not merely enduring, she was awakening, and that awakening would demand reckoning from them all. The Duke learned of Clarissa's truth not through confession, but through absence, through the subtle withdrawal that followed her quiet awakening, and when the understanding finally reached him it arrived in fragments, incomplete yet unmistakable. A hesitation where certainty had once stood, a pause before agreement, a look that drifted past him rather than toward him. These small deviations unsettled him more profoundly than any direct accusation might have done. Alistair Ravenshaw had been trained to read rooms, to sense shifts in allegiance and intent, and he recognized with uneasy clarity that the engagement he had accepted as inevitable now rested on ground far less stable than he had allowed himself to believe. He sought Margaret that afternoon under the pretense of routine, requesting her presence in the estate office where preparations continued with relentless order, and when she entered, he found himself regarding her not as function but as steadiness, the one presence that had not altered its integrity, despite everything else shifting around him. He spoke carefully, not naming Clarissa's admission but acknowledging that the future he had prepared for himself now felt uncertain in ways he could no longer ignore. His voice remained controlled, yet Margaret heard beneath it the strain of a man confronting the cost of emotional denial, the dawning realization that endurance was not synonymous with wisdom. Margaret listened without interruption, offering no immediate reassurance, for she understood that this moment did not belong to comfort but to clarity. When she did speak, her words were measured, grounded in honesty rather than solace. She reminded him gently that obligation, once questioned, could not be restored through force of will alone, and that truth, once recognized, demanded response. She did not advise him toward any outcome, nor did she shield him from discomfort. Instead, she offered presence, the quiet anchoring that came from being fully attentive without seeking to direct. The Duke felt the steadiness of that presence keenly. For the first time, he allowed the possibility that the life he had accepted without resistance might not be the life he was meant to live, and the recognition unsettled him deeply. He did not speak of love, nor did he name the connection that bound him to the woman before him, yet the awareness of her as emotional anchor was impossible to deny. In her restraint, he found a mirror for his own, and in her clarity, a challenge he could no longer avoid. When the conversation ended, nothing had been decided, yet something irrevocable had begun. Margaret left the room with composed steps, aware of the ethical weight of the moment she had just witnessed. She had not sought influence, yet she could no longer deny its presence. The Duke remained behind, staring at the ordered stacks of papers as though they belonged to a life already receding. As the afternoon light shifted across the estate, both understood, in different ways, that the engagement stood at the edge of transformation. What came next would require more than restraint or endurance. It would require choice, and neither could yet predict where that choice would lead. Margaret became aware of her influence not through assertion, but through consequence, through the quiet realization that her presence now shaped the contours of decisions unfolding around her, and the awareness unsettled her more deeply than any accusation might have done. She had never sought to guide outcomes, only to serve with integrity, yet she could no longer deny that her words lingered after conversations ended, that her restraint created space in which truths surfaced rather than receded. The Duke's reflections bore the imprint of her counsel, not because she directed him, but because she refused to soften what clarity required, and the weight of that responsibility pressed upon her with unfamiliar force. She moved through the estate with renewed attentiveness, conscious that every interaction carried implication. Servants deferred to her as they always had, yet now she sensed curiosity beneath their efficiency, an awareness that something subtle had shifted within the household's emotional order. Margaret countered this by tightening her composure, maintaining the calm authority that had long defined her role, determined that no personal uncertainty would manifest as disorder. Still, She could not escape the truth that neutrality had become illusion. Silence itself now functioned as influence, shaping perception through absence rather than declaration. Internally, the conflict sharpened. Margaret had always believed that restraint protected others from harm, that withholding herself preserved balance, yet she began to see how endurance without honesty could enable a greater untruth. The realization did not embolden her, it burdened her. She questioned whether remaining near the Duke, even in propriety, constituted an unspoken intervention, and whether withdrawal would clarify or merely abandon him to expectation. The moral complexity of her position grew heavier with each passing hour, and she found no easy resolution within the habits that had once steadied her. When the Duke passed her in the corridor later that day, their exchange was brief, courteous, and outwardly unremarkable. Yet Margaret sensed the depth of his attention in the pause before he spoke, the way his gaze held hers with a seriousness that acknowledged shared awareness. He did not ask for guidance, and she did not offer it, yet the recognition between them felt decisive, as though both understood that the path ahead could no longer be shaped by avoidance alone. The restraint they shared was no longer defensive. It had become deliberate, an acknowledgement of stakes rather than denial of them. That evening, alone in her chamber, Margaret reflected with quiet resolve. She had lived her life believing that significance belonged to others, that her role was to support rather than shape, but circumstance had drawn her into a position where integrity demanded engagement rather than disappearance. She did not yet know what action, honesty would require, only that endurance without examination was no longer sufficient. The wedding advanced toward its appointed hour, every detail aligning with practiced precision, yet beneath the order lay a growing certainty that resolution would soon be demanded, and that when it came, she would be required not merely to endure, but to choose. Clarissa's decision to question the engagement emerged not as rupture, but as reconsideration, expressed with the same composure that had governed every step of her conduct, and when she requested a private audience with the Duke, the household sensed the significance even before a word was spoken. Margaret was not present for the conversation, yet she felt its weight ripple through the estate all the same, the air charged with a quiet expectancy that no amount of routine could dispel. Servants moved with heightened care, voices lowered, as though the walls themselves had learned to listen. When Clarissa emerged from the Duke's study, her expression was serene but resolute, and Margaret recognized at once the calm that followed, a decision long delayed. Clarissa did not seek her out immediately, nor did she avoid her. Instead, she resumed her duties with a steadiness that suggested clarity rather than denial. The engagement, Margaret learned later through careful channels, had been postponed rather than dissolved, framed publicly as prudence rather than uncertainty, a decision that preserved dignity while acknowledging fracture. Society would accept delay more readily than truth, and Clarissa understood this instinctively. The Duke carried the conversation differently. His composure remained intact, yet Margaret sensed a shift in his bearing, a quiet release of tension that had long been held in check. When their paths crossed that evening, his greeting was formal, yet his gaze lingered with a seriousness that suggested gratitude rather than relief. He did not speak of the decision, nor did she invite explanation, yet Margaret felt the gravity of the moment settle between them. Something irrevocable had occurred, not an ending, but a beginning shaped by honesty rather than obligation. Internally, Margaret wrestled with conflicting emotions. Relief surfaced first, followed quickly by unease, for postponement did not resolve the deeper truth she now carried. Clarissa's courage had opened a space where choice could no longer be avoided, and Margaret understood that remaining silent within that space was itself a form of participation. She questioned whether her presence continued to steady or to complicate, whether withdrawal would clarify or merely delay the reckoning now underway. The household responded to the news with subdued curiosity. There was no scandal, only speculation carefully contained, and Margaret navigated the inquiries with composed neutrality, offering no interpretation, reaffirming only the practical adjustments required by the delay. Her professionalism shielded her from suspicion, yet she felt the subtle shift in how others regarded her, as though she now stood closer to the center of events than her station ordinarily permitted. As night settled over Hawthorne Estate, Margaret recognized with quiet certainty that postponement was not resolution. The engagement had been suspended, but the truth beneath it had been awakened, and once awakened, it demanded response. She sensed that the path ahead would soon require separation rather than proximity, not as punishment, but as clarity. The wedding might yet occur, or it might dissolve entirely, but Margaret understood that her role within this unfolding story could not remain unchanged. Choice, once invited, would not be easily dismissed, and she felt the steady approach of a moment when endurance would no longer suffice. Margaret resolved to withdraw not in haste, but with the same deliberation that had governed every difficult choice of her life, understanding now that proximity, however restrained, had become its own form of speech. The postponement of the engagement altered nothing essential in her position. If anything, it sharpened the ethical tension she could no longer ignore. She reduced her presence where it was not strictly required, delegated responsibilities she would once have overseen herself, and ensured that every interaction with the Duke remained impeccably formal, her tone measured, her demeanor composed. She told herself that distance was not abandonment, but necessity, the only means by which clarity might emerge, unclouded by emotional influence. The Duke noticed the change almost immediately. Where once her steady presence had anchored his thoughts, there was now absence, deliberate and unmistakable, and he found himself unsettled by how acutely he felt it. When he finally addressed her, it was not in accusation, but in quiet urgency, asking whether he had caused offense, whether her withdrawal signaled disapproval. Margaret answered with careful honesty, explaining that restraint was sometimes the most honorable course, particularly when truth had begun to surface and required space to be examined without interference. She spoke of propriety not as limitation but as protection, emphasizing that clarity demanded distance rather than intimacy. The conversation strained both of them. The Duke pressed gently, arguing that avoidance could not undo what had already been recognized, that silence did not erase understanding. Margaret listened, her composure unwavering, yet she felt the cost of her resolve keenly. She reminded him that acknowledgement did not necessitate pursuit, and that responsibility, once awakened, required discipline rather than indulgence. Her words were firm, but not unkind, and the restraint they carried seemed to wound him more deeply than reproach might have done. When they parted, neither felt relief. Margaret returned to her duties with steady precision, yet the weight of what she had refused lingered heavily within her. She understood that withdrawal did not absolve her of influence. It merely shifted its form. Absence could shape decisions as powerfully as presence, and she questioned whether her attempt at neutrality might itself be interpreted as judgment. Still, she held to her course, believing that endurance, when aligned with integrity, was not cowardice but courage. That evening, alone in her chamber, Margaret confronted the truth she could no longer deny. Returning to emotional neutrality was impossible. Recognition had altered the ground beneath her feet, and distance, however necessary, did not restore what had been lost. She wondered whether restraint preserved honor or merely postponed reckoning, and the uncertainty troubled her deeply. Beyond her door, Hawthorne Estate continued its ordered rhythm, the postponed wedding lingering like an unresolved chord, and Margaret sensed that the space she had created would soon demand response from them all. Withdrawal had clarified the stakes but had not resolved them. She understood with steady certainty that endurance alone would no longer suffice, and that the path ahead, whatever shape it took, would require courage not just to refrain, but to face the consequences of truth once spoken, even when spoken only through silence. The confrontation between the Duke and Clarissa unfolded without witnesses and without raised voices, a private reckoning shaped by dignity rather than drama, and when it concluded, its effects settled quietly but decisively across Hawthorne Estate. Margaret did not hear the words exchanged, yet she sensed the shift immediately, the way tension loosened from the corridors, the way servants moved with a cautious relief that required no explanation. Whatever had been spoken behind closed doors had been spoken honestly, and honesty, once introduced, altered the air itself. Clarissa emerged from the Duke's study composed and self-possessed, her bearing unaltered yet clarified, as though a burden long carried had finally been set down. She addressed the household with measured calm later that afternoon, confirming that the engagement would remain postponed, the decision framed publicly as thoughtful prudence rather than emotional rupture. There was no scandal to seize upon, no spectacle to invite judgment, only the quiet assertion of agency within boundaries society could accept. Margaret observed her with deep respect, recognizing the courage it took to choose integrity over convenience without demanding applause. The Duke carried the outcome differently. His composure remained intact, but Margaret sensed a profound shift beneath it, not relief, but resolve. When their paths crossed that evening, His greeting was courteous, yet weighted with unspoken understanding. He did not seek her counsel, nor did he attempt to draw her back into proximity, and she recognized the restraint as deliberate, a mirror of her own. Something essential had been acknowledged between him and Clarissa, and that acknowledgement had freed him from a pretense he could no longer sustain. Internally, Margaret felt the consequences of the confrontation settle with quiet inevitability. The postponement had become something more definitive, not merely delay but recognition that the engagement could not proceed unchanged. She questioned her role once more, examining whether her presence had steadied or unsettled, and whether her continued service served integrity or merely habit. The answers offered no comfort, only clarity. The household adjusted swiftly, conversation shifting toward practical recalibration rather than speculation, and Margaret guided the transition with her usual precision, ensuring that decorum remained intact. Yet beneath her competence lay the steady awareness that the structure she had been sustaining was no longer viable in its previous form. Clarissa's honesty had altered the moral landscape, and Margaret understood that neutrality was no longer a refuge. That night, as Margaret reviewed revised schedules by lamplight, she acknowledged what had become unavoidable. The engagement was not merely postponed, it was dismantling with care. The Duke had chosen truth over preservation, Clarissa had chosen agency over endurance, and Margaret stood at the edge of a choice she could no longer defer. Remaining within Hawthorne Estate now risked misinterpretation, not of conduct, but of intention, and she felt the quiet certainty that separation was no longer optional but necessary. The confrontation had resolved one truth while illuminating another. Duty, once clarified, demanded alignment, and for Margaret, alignment no longer lay in remaining where honesty had shifted the ground beneath her feet. The decision to leave took hold not as grief but as resolve, settling within Margaret with a clarity that surprised her by its calm. The household had adjusted to the postponed engagement with remarkable efficiency, conversations returning to routine, schedules rewritten, expectations reshaped to accommodate uncertainty without acknowledging its cause. Outwardly, Hawthorne Estate appeared restored to order, yet Margaret felt more visible than ever, her presence newly weighted with implication. Glances lingered longer, voices softened when she entered a room, and though no accusation was spoken, she understood that proximity alone invited interpretation. She moved through her duties with the same precision that had always defined her, ensuring that transitions unfolded smoothly, that Clarissa's dignity remained intact, that the Duke's authority was supported without question. Yet beneath her composure lay the steady recognition that her continued presence now risked undermining the very propriety she sought to protect. Integrity, she realized, required more than correct behavior. It demanded alignment between intention and circumstance, and that alignment no longer existed here. Margaret began to prepare her departure quietly, organizing records, instructing junior staff, ensuring that nothing essential depended solely upon her. She framed her plans as natural progression, a lady's companion moving on once her charge no longer required her particular oversight. The explanation was sound, socially acceptable, and she delivered it with composed confidence, yet each practical step carried an emotional weight she refused to name. Leaving was not escape, nor was it sacrifice. It was necessity. The Duke did not seek her out during these preparations, and Margaret was grateful for the restraint. She sensed his awareness nonetheless, the gravity of his attention when their paths crossed, the care with which he avoided imposing upon her resolve. Their interactions were courteous, minimal, shaped by mutual understanding rather than avoidance, and Margaret recognized the respect embedded within that distance. It steadied her, even as it sharpened the cost of what remained unsaid. Clarissa acknowledged Margaret's intention with grace, expressing gratitude without possessiveness, wishing her well without inquiry. The exchange affirmed Margaret's decision more firmly than reassurance ever could. There was no resentment, only quiet recognition that change, once begun, required completion. On her final evening, Margaret stood alone in her chamber, the room already bearing signs of departure, and reflected not on what she was leaving behind, but on what she had claimed for herself. She had chosen integrity over comfort, clarity over endurance, and though the future remained uncertain, it would be entered honestly. As she extinguished the lamp and prepared for rest, Margaret felt neither regret nor triumph, only steadiness. She understood now that some departures were not losses but corrections, aligning one's life with truth rather than expectation. Whatever awaited her beyond Hawthorne Estate, it would be faced without disguise, and that knowledge, hard, earned, and quietly claimed, felt like the beginning of something she had never before allowed herself to imagine. The Duke intercepted her on the morning she intended to finalize her departure, not with command or urgency, but with a quiet determination that left no room for misunderstanding. He waited near the smaller receiving room, removed from the household's usual flow, and when Margaret arrived with a ledger tucked beneath her arm, she recognized at once that avoidance would no longer serve either of them. He asked if they might speak, his tone measured, respectful, and she agreed, though her pulse quickened with the knowledge that this conversation would test the resolve she had worked so carefully to maintain. He did not begin by challenging her decision. Instead, he acknowledged it, speaking plainly of her integrity, of the steadiness she had brought to a household in flux, and of the absence her departure would create. His words were not framed as appeal but as recognition, and it was that recognition that unsettled Margaret most. When he asked her to remain, it was not as staff, nor even as convenience, but as herself, a request stripped of entitlement and offered with visible restraint. He spoke of partnership rather than protection, of choosing with intention rather than yielding to expectation, and for a moment Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She answered with calm clarity, refusing the request not out of fear but conviction. She explained that remaining under such terms would invite imbalance, that affection without equality was not refuge but risk. She would not accept a place defined by gratitude or proximity to power, nor would she allow herself to be reshaped by another's awakening. If she stayed, it would be as an equal or not at all, and the conditions for such equality could not be forged within the walls that had first defined her as subordinate. The Duke listened without interruption, absorbing her words with a seriousness that reflected genuine understanding. He did not argue, nor did he retreat into authority. Instead, he acknowledged the truth of her position, accepting that what he had offered, however sincere, did not yet meet the standard she required. The restraint he showed in that moment mattered to her more than persuasion ever could. When they parted, it was without resolution but not without respect. Margaret felt the cost of refusal keenly, yet she did not doubt it. As she returned to her preparations, she understood that dignity was not preserved by clinging to possibility, but by honoring the self that had finally learned to speak. The Duke remained behind, confronted not with rejection, but with a challenge that demanded transformation rather than concession. And Margaret, though still bound for departure, sensed that the path ahead had shifted once more, not towards certainty, but toward a truth that could no longer be denied by either of them. Separation did not arrive with drama, nor did it announce itself with finality. It settled instead into silence, a deliberate quiet that followed Margaret's departure from Hawthorne Estate, like a held breath neither she nor the Duke quite released. Her leaving was orderly, almost understated, her possessions few, her farewells polite and contained, and by the time the carriage rolled beyond the gates, the household resumed its rhythms with practiced efficiency. Yet absence reshaped the estate in ways routine could not disguise, and the spaces Margaret had occupied now carried a stillness that felt newly exposed. For Margaret, distance brought no immediate relief. She returned to a modest lodging arranged through long-standing connections, familiar and unremarkable, and resumed a life shaped by self, sufficiency rather than belonging. Her days filled quickly with correspondence, with inquiries discreetly made and positions quietly considered, yet beneath the activity lay an ache she refused to name. She did not write to the Duke, nor did she permit herself to imagine his response to her absence. Silence, she told herself, was not punishment but preservation, the only means by which truth could be tested without interference. The Duke, for his part, immersed himself in duty with renewed intensity, attending to estate matters with a focus that left little room for reflection during daylight hours. Yet in the quiet of evening, when obligations receded, he felt the weight of what had been withheld. Margaret's absence sharpened his awareness of how thoroughly she had steadied him, not through reassurance, but through clarity, and he recognized that the silence between them was not empty, but charged with unspoken reckoning. He drafted letters he did not send, each one discarded as insufficient, unwilling to risk words that might either bind or diminish what remained unresolved. Days passed, then weeks, and still the silence held. It tested them both, revealing not merely longing, but conviction. Margaret began to understand that distance had not diminished what she felt, but clarified it, stripping away illusion until only truth remained. She did not miss Hawthorne Estate itself, nor the role she had fulfilled there. What lingered was recognition, the memory of being met without disguise, and the knowledge that she could not return to a life defined solely by endurance. The Duke reached a similar understanding through absence rather than proximity. Without Margaret's presence to anchor his reflections, he was forced to confront the emptiness of decisions made without authenticity. He recognized that restraint, once mistaken for virtue, had served only to delay reckoning, and that silence, however dignified, could not substitute for choice. By the end of the month, both understood that separation had done its work. It had neither erased feeling nor resolved uncertainty, but it had revealed what remained when endurance was stripped of habit. Silence had become its own answer, and neither could pretend any longer that what lay between them belonged to the past. The question was no longer whether they would speak again, but whether truth, once recognized, would finally be claimed rather than endured. Clarissa's departure was announced without ceremony, framed as a visit of extended duration rather than a decisive turning away. Yet Margaret understood its significance the moment the letter arrived, written in Clarissa's careful hand and addressed not as duty but as gratitude. Clarissa wrote of intention rather than escape, of choosing a path shaped by honesty even when its destination remained uncertain, and she thanked Margaret not for guidance, but for example, for demonstrating that dignity need not require self-erasure. The words unsettled Margaret more than praise ever could, for they named an influence she had never sought yet could not deny. They met briefly before Clarissa left the region, choosing a quiet sitting room removed from observation, and the farewell was marked not by regret, but by mutual recognition. Clarissa spoke openly of her decision to pursue a life aligned with her own affections, wherever that path might lead, acknowledging that safety without truth had proven a heavier burden than uncertainty. Margaret listened with a steadiness born of understanding, offering no caution, no counsel, only the affirmation that choosing oneself was neither selfish nor reckless when done with clarity. The exchange closed a chapter that had been shaped by restraint rather than conflict, and Margaret felt an unexpected lightness settle where tension had once lived. News of Clarissa's departure reached Hawthorne Estate quietly, yet its impact was unmistakable. The household adjusted with subdued efficiency, conversations shifting toward what came next rather than what had been lost, and the Duke accepted the change with measured resolve. He did not speak publicly of the reasons, nor did he invite speculation, choosing instead to let dignity stand in place of explanation. Margaret learned of his composure second-hand, through letters and passing remarks, and though distance remained between them, she sensed the steadiness of his choice more clearly than she ever had in proximity. For Margaret, Clarissa's farewell brought both closure and challenge. It affirmed that integrity could alter lives without overt action, that restraint, when paired with honesty, might serve as catalyst rather than barrier. Yet it also sharpened the question she had deferred, whether she herself would continue to live within the safety of endurance or step fully into the agency she now recognized. Clarissa had chosen movement. The Duke, she sensed, was nearing his own reckoning. The only uncertainty that remained belonged to her. As Margaret folded Clarissa's letter and set it aside, she acknowledged with quiet resolve that the story unfolding around her no longer belonged solely to others. Choice, once awakened, demanded response, and she could no longer pretend that withdrawal alone constituted resolution. Clarissa's departure had cleared the field of pretense, leaving behind only truth and consequence. And in that clarity, Margaret understood that whatever came next would require not disappearance, but presence, claimed deliberately and without apology. The Duke dissolved the engagement publicly with the same restraint that had defined every other difficult choice of his life, offering no explanation beyond what propriety required, and allowing society to fill the silence with assumptions it found more comfortable than truth. The announcement was delivered through formal channels, measured and dignified, framed as a mutual decision reached with care rather than urgency, and Hawthorne Estate absorbed it without spectacle. There were murmurs, of course, curiosity sharpened by the absence of scandal, yet the lack of visible discord disarmed even the most eager observers. What remained was consequence, quietly born. Alistair Ravenshaw accepted the scrutiny without flinching. Invitations were withdrawn, alliances recalibrated, expectations revised, and he met each adjustment with calm resolve. The absence of a future he had once considered inevitable did not unsettle him as he might have expected. Instead, it clarified something long obscured, revealing how much of his life had been shaped by acquiescence rather than conviction. He did not regret the dissolution. He regretted only the years spent mistaking endurance for wisdom. In the days that followed, he turned inward with an honesty he had long deferred. Without the structure of an impending marriage to define his choices, he confronted the emptiness that obligation alone had failed to fill. He reviewed estate matters with renewed attention, not as distraction but as grounding, and found that leadership exercised with intention rather than habit carried a different weight. The household responded to the shift subtly, sensing not instability but direction, and for the first time in many years, the Duke felt aligned with the life he was actively choosing rather than maintaining. Margaret learned of the dissolution through careful correspondence, the news arriving without commentary, yet its significance settled deeply within her. Clarissa's path was now unmistakably her own, and the Duke had accepted the cost of authenticity without retreat. The knowledge stirred neither triumph nor fear, only recognition. A door had closed decisively, not in pursuit of another, but in service of truth. That distinction mattered more than declaration. For the Duke, the choice marked a turning point. He understood now that reputation could be recovered, alliances rebuilt, but a life lived without alignment could not be redeemed through appearances alone. The restraint he had once prized now served a different purpose, not as shield, but as discipline, guiding him toward a future shaped by intention rather than inheritance. As he stood one evening at the edge of the gardens, the house quiet behind him, Alistair Ravenshaw acknowledged with unflinching clarity that the life he had dismantled could not be reconstructed in its former shape. Whatever came next would require vulnerability rather than compliance, courage rather than control. The engagement had ended not as loss, but as release, and in that release lay the possibility of something he had never before permitted himself to claim, a future chosen rather than endured. Margaret returned to Hawthorne Estate under the guise of finality, her visit framed as practical necessity rather than emotional risk, and yet from the moment she crossed the familiar threshold, she felt the quiet intensity of a place altered by truth. The corridors seemed wider, the air less burdened, as though the house itself had exhaled after long restraint, and Margaret moved through it with composed steps, determined to retrieve what remained of her former life without reopening what had been deliberately set aside. Her presence was brief by intention, her purpose narrowly defined, and still the weight of memory pressed close, every familiar sound echoing with what had once been held in silence. She encountered the Duke unexpectedly near the smaller library, the same room where so many unguarded conversations had nearly crossed into confession, and for a moment, neither spoke. Time seemed to pause, allowing recognition to pass between them without mediation, and Margaret felt the steadying force of clarity settle where uncertainty had once lived. Alistair Ravenshaw looked different to her now, not softened, but steadied, his composure no longer strained by pretense, but anchored in resolve. He greeted her with courtesy unmarred by hesitation, and she returned it in kind, grateful for the restraint they both maintained. Their exchange was brief, measured, yet charged with meaning. He acknowledged her return without question, offering assistance she declined gently, reaffirming the boundary she had drawn not through rejection but through self-respect. As they spoke, Margaret sensed the difference wrought by choice freely made. The absence of the engagement, once so central to the estate's rhythm, had altered not only circumstance but presence, and the Duke's attention now carried no confusion, only recognition grounded in accountability. When Margaret gathered the last of her belongings, the task felt symbolic rather than sentimental. She folded letters, closed drawers, and released a chapter of her life not with regret, but with quiet gratitude for what it had taught her. As she prepared to depart once more, the Duke joined her at the threshold, not to dissuade but to acknowledge, and in his words she heard neither claim nor appeal, only the acceptance of consequence. He thanked her for the clarity she had brought, for the truth she had upheld without demand, and she received the gratitude with humility, understanding its weight. As Margaret stepped away from the estate, the tension between them lingered like a held breath finally released. Nothing had been resolved, yet everything had been named through action rather than speech. She understood now that growth did not require constant proximity, only honesty sustained over time. The encounter had affirmed what separation had begun. That choice, once claimed, reshaped connection rather than erasing it. When the gates closed behind her, Margaret felt neither loss nor relief, only readiness. The past no longer bound her, and the future, though uncertain, was hers to enter without disguise. What remained between her and the Duke had survived distance not as longing alone, but as recognition tempered by respect, and she sensed with steady confidence that whatever reckoning lay ahead would meet her not as obligation, but as equal ground. The reckoning came not in grandeur, but in directness, arriving with the simplicity Margaret had once believed impossible, and when the Duke sought her out weeks later, requesting a meeting away from Hawthorne and free of formality, she recognized the inevitability of the moment without fear. They met in a modest drawing-room belonging to a mutual acquaintance, neutral ground chosen deliberately, stripped of titles and memory, and as Margaret entered, she sensed at once that avoidance had reached its natural end. Alistair Ravenshaw rose to greet her without ceremony, his posture composed, his expression unguarded in a way she had never seen before. He did not speak at once. Instead, he waited until they were seated, until the quiet had settled fully around them, and then he asked her plainly what she wanted, not what she believed was proper, nor what circumstance demanded, but what she herself would choose if nothing stood in the way. The question landed with unmistakable weight, for it required honesty without shelter, and Margaret felt the familiar instinct to deflect rise sharply before she stilled it. She understood that anything less than truth would be another form of erasure. She answered slowly, choosing clarity over caution, acknowledging that what lay between them had never been confusion but restraint, and that affection, once recognized, could not be undone by distance or discipline. She spoke of the cost of living within expectation, of how often she had mistaken endurance for virtue, and of her refusal to return to a life defined by invisibility. She named her feeling without embellishment, neither pleading nor apologetic, and insisted that desire, if acknowledged, must stand alongside autonomy rather than replace it. She would not be chosen as consolation, nor would she accept a place shaped by gratitude or imbalance. The Duke listened without interruption, absorbing her words with a gravity that reflected genuine understanding rather than wounded pride. When he responded, he did not offer reassurance or promise ease. Instead, he acknowledged the risk inherent in choosing one another honestly, the consequences such a choice would invite, and his willingness to bear them without retreat. He spoke not of fate, but of responsibility, not of possession, but of partnership freely entered and freely sustained. The exchange stripped away illusion, leaving behind a shared truth neither could deny. Margaret felt no rush of triumph, only steadiness, the calm that followed, finally speaking without disguise. She understood then that the moment was not about resolution but alignment, about standing openly in what had already been true. When they parted, there was no declaration, no embrace to seal what had been spoken. Yet as Margaret stepped back into the world, she carried with her the quiet certainty that something irrevocable had shifted. The reckoning had named not only what she felt, but who she had become, and whatever path lay ahead would now be entered with intention rather than endurance, truth rather than restraint. They did not pretend the choice before them was simple, nor did they seek to soften it with romance, and as the conversation continued, Margaret felt the gravity of what was being weighed settle into her bones with unmistakable clarity. To choose one another openly would not erase consequence, it would invite it. Society would not forget the dissolved engagement, nor would it welcome a woman who stepped beyond the boundaries assigned to her without explanation or apology. Margaret understood this with painful precision, and she refused to accept any version of love that required her to be shielded rather than respected. She spoke plainly of her conditions, not as demands but as truths. She would no longer compromise. She would not belong to him as refuge or reward, nor would she accept a future shaped by gratitude for his choosing. If they were to stand together, it would be as equals, her voice carrying weight not because it was permitted, but because it was valued. She would retain her independence, her work, her capacity to stand without him even as she chose to stand beside him. Love, to her, was not surrender but recognition, and she would not accept anything less. The Duke received her words with visible concentration, not startled, not defensive, but reflective. He acknowledged that power, once unexamined, distorted even the most sincere intentions, and that if he wished to claim partnership rather than possession, he would have to dismantle habits formed over a lifetime. He spoke of relearning authority not as dominance, but as stewardship, of understanding that equality did not diminish him, but demanded growth he had long deferred. His response did not promise ease, it promised effort, accountability, and the willingness to be corrected rather than obeyed. Margaret listened, weighing not the eloquence of his words but the discipline behind them. She recognized the difference between desire and commitment, between attraction and transformation, and she sensed that he understood the distinction as well. The risk remained, stark and unavoidable, yet for the first time it did not feel isolating. They were not choosing comfort, but alignment, not escape, but honesty sustained through consequence. The decision, when it came, was mutual rather than dramatic. There was no declaration of certainty, only an agreement to move forward deliberately, allowing action rather than promise to shape what followed. Margaret felt neither fear nor exhilaration, only steadiness, the quiet assurance that came from refusing to abandon herself in the act of choosing another. As they rose to leave, the world beyond the room felt unchanged, and yet Margaret knew she had crossed a threshold that could not be receded from. Whatever awaited them would test resolve rather than passion, courage rather than impulse, and she welcomed that test without illusion. She had not chosen love over safety, she had chosen truth over avoidance, and in that choice she had claimed not only partnership, but herself. The Duke did not attempt to close the distance between them in the days that followed, and Margaret recognized the restraint as deliberate rather than hesitant, a choice to allow truth the space to prove itself through action rather than reassurance. He did not summon her, did not flood her with letters or gestures meant to persuade, and in that absence of pressure, she found something unexpectedly grounding. Partnership, she realized, was being offered not through insistence but through patience, and patience carried its own quiet authority. When they met again, it was by mutual agreement and without ceremony, their conversation shaped less by emotion than by intention. The Duke spoke openly of fear, not of scandal or rejection, but of repeating a life defined by compliance rather than conviction. He acknowledged how easily restraint had become a shield, how control had replaced vulnerability, and how choosing authenticity now required dismantling habits long mistaken for strength. There was no self-pity in his words, only accountability, and Margaret listened with the discernment she had honed over years of necessity. She weighed his vulnerability carefully, aware that confession alone did not equal transformation. What mattered was his willingness to be changed by truth rather than comforted by it. When she questioned him, he did not defend himself, nor did he retreat into authority. Instead, he listened, accepting correction without resentment, and in that willingness she recognized something rare, a man prepared to be reshaped rather than merely affirmed. Margaret spoke then of her own fear, quieter but no less profound, the fear of losing herself within a life larger than her own, of being absorbed by another's world until her edges blurred beyond recognition. She explained that love, for her, could not mean disappearance, that she would not sacrifice autonomy for belonging, nor exchange independence for security. The Duke received this not as limitation but as boundary, and he acknowledged its necessity without reservation. What passed between them in that exchange was not romance but alignment, the slow settling of two lives choosing to meet without hierarchy. Margaret felt no rush of certainty, only a deepening calm, the sense that she was no longer negotiating her worth, but stating it plainly. The Duke did not promise permanence. He promised presence, effort, and the humility to continue choosing rather than assuming. When they parted, it was with the understanding that their future would be shaped not by declarations but by sustained truth. Margaret walked away feeling neither claimed nor alone, but accompanied by the quiet assurance that she had been heard without compromise. For the first time, partnership did not feel like risk disguised as hope, but like a discipline she could willingly undertake. Whatever lay ahead would demand vigilance rather than fantasy, but Margaret welcomed that demand. She had spent a lifetime enduring. Now, she was choosing, and the difference reshaped everything. Margaret's understanding of herself shifted not through revelation but through steadiness, the quiet accumulation of choices honored rather than deferred, and as days unfolded she felt the unfamiliar sensation of inhabiting her own life without apology. She continued her work, accepting short-term positions that suited her skill and independence, refusing arrangements that implied obligation rather than respect, and in doing so she recognized how often she had once accepted less than she deserved, simply because it was offered without challenge. Now, she evaluated each opportunity with clarity, asking not whether it was safe, but whether it was aligned. Her connection with the Duke remained deliberate, shaped by conversation rather than assumption, and Margaret noted with careful attention how consistently he honored the boundaries she had named. He did not intrude upon her decisions, nor did he attempt to absorb her world into his own. Instead, he met her where she stood, listening more than speaking, asking rather than directing, and the constancy of that effort mattered more than grand gesture ever could. She began to trust not the absence of risk, but the presence of accountability. Internally, Margaret confronted the remnants of habit that still urged her toward disappearance, the instinct to soften her voice, to yield ground unnecessarily, to retreat when recognition felt uncomfortable. She resisted these impulses consciously, reminding herself that dignity was not maintained through self-erasure, but through clarity upheld even when it unsettled others. Each time she chose to speak plainly, to remain present rather than defer, she felt a small but decisive reinforcement of identity, a confirmation that courage could be practiced rather than summoned. The Duke, too, appeared altered by the discipline of choice. Without the structure of expectation to dictate his course, he approached decisions with reflection rather than assumption, and Margaret observed how his authority shifted in tone, less declarative, more responsive. He did not relinquish leadership, but he redefined it, allowing space for dissent, for correction, for voices previously unheard. The change was subtle but profound, and Margaret recognized in it the difference between power exercised and power examined. Their time together was unremarkable in outward appearance, walks taken without audience, conversations held without witness. Yet beneath the simplicity lay intention, the shared understanding that intimacy earned through honesty required maintenance rather than proclamation. Margaret did not feel consumed by the connection, nor diminished by it. Instead, she felt expanded, as though the life she had carefully contained had begun to breathe more fully. In the quiet of her evenings, Margaret reflected not on what she had gained, but on what she had refused to lose. She had not traded autonomy for affection, nor silence for security. She had chosen herself first, and in doing so, found that partnership no longer threatened her integrity. Whatever the future held, it would be entered not as surrender, but as alignment, and that truth steadied her more deeply than certainty ever could. Society responded, as it always did, to quiet defiance, with curiosity sharpened by uncertainty and judgment, softened only by the absence of spectacle. There were murmurs, carefully phrased inquiries, invitations extended and withdrawn with equal politeness, and Margaret encountered them with composed clarity, neither retreating nor performing. She did not attempt to explain herself, nor did she pretend ignorance of the scrutiny. Instead, she met it with steadiness, understanding that dignity did not require approval to remain intact. When she appeared alongside the Duke on rare, deliberate occasions, the reaction was measured rather than explosive. Observers noted the absence of apology in her posture, the ease with which she occupied space once denied her, and the quiet attentiveness with which he regarded her. There was no attempt to disguise their alignment, yet neither did they court notice. The simplicity of their presence unsettled expectation more effectively than defiance ever could. Margaret sensed the recalibration occurring around her, alliances reconsidered, assumptions quietly revised, and she recognized the cost of standing visibly in one's truth. Some doors closed without explanation, others opened cautiously, and she accepted both outcomes without bitterness. She had learned that access granted conditionally was not access worth preserving. What mattered was the integrity with which she moved forward, unburdened by the need to be sanctioned. The Duke bore his share of consequence with equal resolve. His authority was questioned in subtle ways, tested through polite resistance rather than open challenge, yet he met each moment without retreat, allowing his actions rather than declarations to define his leadership. Margaret observed the steadiness of his response and felt a deepening trust take root, not born of protection, but of consistency. In quieter moments, Margaret reflected on how visibility had once frightened her, how she had equated being seen with danger. Now, she understood that invisibility carried its own cost, erasing possibility before it could be claimed. Standing openly did not diminish her, it clarified her. Society would continue to watch, to speculate, to measure, but Margaret no longer felt shaped by that gaze. She had chosen alignment over acceptance, and in doing so, discovered that scrutiny lost its power when met without apology. Trust deepened not through declaration but through endurance, shaped quietly in moments that offered no audience and demanded no performance. Margaret and the Duke learned one another not by idealized vision, but by attention, by the steady discipline of listening and adjustment that revealed character more reliably than passion ever could. Their conversations grew less careful without becoming careless, marked by an ease that had not existed before restraint gave way to choice. Margaret observed how the Duke responded when challenged, how he paused rather than asserted, how he reconsidered rather than commanded. These moments mattered to her more than reassurance, for they demonstrated a willingness to be changed rather than merely admired. She, in turn, allowed herself to speak without rehearsal, to question without apology, to remain present even when disagreement surfaced. Trust, she realized, was not the absence of tension, but the confidence that tension could be held without rupture. Their lives did not merge abruptly. Margaret maintained her work and independence, and the Duke respected the boundaries she had named without treating them as conditions to be endured. Instead, he treated them as structure, something that strengthened rather than limited what they were building. The care with which he honored her autonomy allowed her to relax into connection without fear of disappearance. There were moments of uncertainty, of course, when old habits threatened to reassert themselves, when silence felt easier than truth, but each time, they chose clarity instead. Margaret learned to recognize when withdrawal was instinct rather than wisdom, and the Duke learned when control masked fear rather than leadership. These recognitions were not dramatic, but cumulative, reshaping the foundation beneath them. In this steadier space, longing softened into companionship, desire into partnership. What bound them was no longer anticipation but presence, the shared understanding that intimacy sustained over time required vigilance, humility, and mutual accountability. Margaret felt herself grounded rather than swept away, accompanied rather than overtaken. As days turned toward weeks, she understood that trust was not something granted once, but practiced continually. And in that practice, she found not safety disguised as love, but a love disciplined enough to hold truth without fracture. The commitment they made was private by design, stripped of ceremony and untouched by expectation, formed not in opposition to the world, but in quiet alignment with themselves. There was no announcement to mark it, no audience to confirm its legitimacy, only the shared understanding that what they chose would be sustained through action rather than promise. Margaret found unexpected strength in the absence of spectacle. What mattered was not how the bond appeared, but how it held. They spoke plainly of what lay ahead, of time rather than certainty, of effort rather than assurance. The Duke did not frame the future as something he would provide, but as something they would build, piece by deliberate piece, with room for correction and growth. Margaret listened, not searching for perfection, but for truth, and she recognized it in the steadiness of his intent. He did not seek to bind her to him. He asked instead whether she would continue to choose alongside him, even when choice required patience rather than passion. She answered without hesitation, not because doubt had vanished, but because fear no longer governed her decisions. The life she had nearly accepted, defined by quiet usefulness and careful absence, now felt distant, not through rejection but through transformation. Preparing a wedding for another woman had once symbolized the limits of her place in the world. Now, it stood as a reminder of what she had outgrown. They marked the commitment simply, a moment held in stillness rather than ritual, and Margaret felt no need for witness. What mattered was the discipline it represented, the promise to remain present, to speak rather than retreat, to choose alignment even when habit urged concealment. Love, she realized, was not validated by inevitability or fate, but by clarity renewed daily. As they parted that evening, there was no sense of conclusion, only continuation. Margaret walked away with the quiet assurance that she had not been swept into another's life, but had stepped fully into her own. The path ahead would not be effortless, nor was it guaranteed, but it was honest. And in that honesty, she found something deeper than certainty. She found commitment grounded not in what was almost lost, but in what was consciously claimed. Margaret sometimes thought of the wedding she had once prepared, not with regret, but with clarity, as one might recall a life nearly lived, and recognize the quiet courage it took to turn away. What had begun as duty had revealed truth, not through rupture, but through recognition, and in that recognition she had found herself reshaped. The life she now inhabited was not grander, but truer, defined less by position than by presence, less by expectation than by choice. She and the Duke stood side by side without spectacle, their bond no longer charged by longing, but steadied by trust earned over time. There was ease between them now, not born of certainty, but of mutual respect sustained through vigilance and humility. They did not speak often of fate. What bound them was not inevitability, but intention, renewed quietly in daily acts of honesty and restraint. Margaret understood that love, when freely chosen, did not rescue her from duty, but refined it, aligning responsibility with self, respect rather than erasure. She remained wholly herself, neither hidden nor claimed, and in that wholeness found companionship that did not demand surrender. As seasons turned, The memory of lilies arranged for another woman's vows softened into symbol rather than sorrow. The question the Duke had once asked lingered still, not as uncertainty, but as reminder. Fate, she knew now, was not something believed in or denied. It was something shaped, patiently and deliberately, by the courage to choose truth when endurance would have been easier.